Welcome to Writer, a program sponsored by the Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm Marcia Ladendorff, and with me today is Sandra Davidson. Sandra is a writer of historical romance novels. Am I
and time travels.
And time travels, and there's a specific category called time travels.
Yes, there is.
You're not the first to do this.
Oh, no. But if I had written my first time travel when I wanted to, I would have been.
Really? Really? I'm just going to leap into this because
Sure.
That's the part about this book that I found really interesting. I didn't realize that there were authors who are writing about time travel in romance novels.
Mm-hmm.
And The Heart Remembers is the book that I read in the last couple of days that Sandra Davidson wrote. And I was really intrigued with the idea of time travel in a romance novel. It seemed like a neat little hook. Is that how you look at it, or is it even more?
No, I think it's more than that. I think that there's a lot of authors who are writing time travel, and the ones who really love it, I think, wish that they could time travel. Like I wish I could live in another time, you know? I don't feel very comfortable in the 20th century, to tell you the truth.
You don't?
No, I don't.
You'd rather be back in 1870 with...
Yeah, I think that's why I write historical novels, because of that. You know, I do love the history, and I do like... or maybe it's a sense of knowing what has already happened, you know?
Mm-hmm. The other thing that struck me about this book, Sandra, is the tremendous amount of research that you must have done to be able to write about this time. This one was written predominantly in the 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
I know that One Shining Moment was the book that was written before this, was written a little earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about that process, the research process? Because I know it must be tedious.
That's what, when I go to conferences, everyone who is interested in writing historical romances wants to know about the research. But for me, it's not any big deal. I usually go to order my books from Barnes & Nobles. I like to own my own research books, except in the case of these two books that you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. I did go to the St. Augustine Historical Library, and I looked up everything I could about that time period. And so I used actual places, the names of streets, which are different now than they were then. And so I did do a lot of research for that, especially on the Osceola part, which was in the last book, One Shining Moment. I really did get his life down. I interweaved it into my story, but used the actual facts of how he died. It's the last 2 months of his life. And you couldn't possibly take that subplot out of my book and still have that book, because it's intricate to it.
Osceola was really the only real character in that book, or do you use real characters?
Some are real, like General Jessup really was real. He was in charge of the Army here in Florida, and during the Seminole Wars.
But unlike authors like Eugenia Price, or your book has fictional characters in it.
Oh, yes.
And they're the main characters especially are fictional.
Yes.
They're just put into that.
Yeah, you take the character. Well, with me, the way I get into a book in the first place is I usually get an idea. I see a scene in my head that's very vivid. It's usually an action and a conflict kind of a scene. And sometimes the characters come right along with it, and that's really great. And sometimes it doesn't, and I have to invent characters that will work well in that scene.
Can you give me an example, something from this book that may have sparked your idea to do this? Did it come out? It must have come out of One Shining Moment.
Yes, you'd have to go back to One Shining Moment, because this is a sequel to it, really.
Right.
Even though it's a time travel, it's a sequel.
So are you saying that when you get an idea for a book, that's how it comes to you, as a scene?
Yeah, I think I'm a plot person rather than a character person. So I see a scene that intrigues me, and I want to know more about it, and how did we get to this? And this scene intrigues me so much that I want to write a whole book about it, you know? So there'll be a scene in the book that comes to me that way.
Well, can you give me an example of?
I don't even know if I can remember. I can tell you how I got Shining Dawn, and who was the main character in One Shining Moment.
Right.
I knew I needed okay, my hero was a half-breed. He was half Indian and half white, and he's an officer in the Army, and disguising the fact that he's an Indian. And he's ashamed of his Indian heritage until the end of the book, right? And so I needed a character to counteract him. My heroine had to be just the opposite of him so that they would be in conflict all the time. So I invented a white sister for Osceola. He adopts her when she's a little girl. He finds her out in the woods, and he adopts her. And she loves the Indian way of life. So they're in conflict immediately. And that's what I think authors have to do. They have to get so much conflict going, you know, in order to sustain throughout the book, you know.
Right. The conflict sort of drives the book, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Especially in
and
romance.
Motivation.
In romance novels. It seems to me when I go through reading a romance novel that there's always a problem.
Oh, there has to be. And not just romance novels. We operate on the same rules, although I don't really think there are any rules in writing at all. My only rule for writing is, if it works, do it. If it doesn't, you better know it. So I get away with a lot of taboos and stuff like that because I have great motivation for everything my characters do or say. And I get away with it that way. And I just lost my train of thought.
Oh, that's okay. Let's start with how you started. You haven't been writing that long, have you?
No, I haven't.
How long ago did you start?
I started in 1988, and I wrote my first book. I didn't have a computer then. It took me 2 whole years to do it. Well, actually, it took a year and a half, you know, less than 2 years, but it took almost a year.
Oh, my God.
And then I got a computer, and that shortened it to a year for my second book. And then after that, I got down to 6 months, and I don't like to take any less than that because you can't really get the really juicy details that you want to get into book. That really juice it up and give it life, you know.
The flavor and the texture.
And make it a page turner, you know.
Right.
That doesn't come in your first draft.
Right.
That comes later on after you're honing and polishing your book. You know, that's when I see, wait a minute. Something happened early on in the book, and I can use something here that's going to really make that really stand out, you know, and give it more meaning.
Okay, so it took you a year and a half to write your first book. Then what did you do? Did you have an idea who would publish it, or did you just send it to everybody, or how did you go
No,
about it?
I got an agent.
Oh.
Yeah. I met her right here in Florida at a Florida freelance writers conference. Had nothing to do with romance writing. It was an annual conference that's held like around Orlando or Fort Lauderdale. And I was pretty smart, actually. I had an appointment with an agent, and it didn't do too well. And so I saw that this other agent was at the conference, and she was going to be at the awards ceremony. And you could sign up to be at her table. So I looked at the blackboard and saw that there were still, you know, available seats at her table. So when I got to the conference to the table that night, it's a big round table, and that seats 10. And there were 5 seats empty, and she hadn't shown up yet. I knew what she looked like. So I plunked myself down in chair number 3, so there would be only 2 on one side of me and 2 on the other, so I'd have to be near her, right? She sits down right next to me. So I started talking to her, and she asked to see my proposal, and I sent it to her, and she took me on.
What is a proposal?
A proposal is always your synopsis and first 3 chapters. That's it.
Synopsis being sort of a general kind of
Yeah, it's not an outline.
summary.
It's telling the story, the bare bones story, without all the subplots and stuff like that, you know.
What does it generally run, a page or 2?
You know, that really depends on the publisher, what they want, or even agents. They like to keep it as few pages as possible.
Right.
Because they're inundated with proposals all the time, you know. But
So
I think mine ran about 12 pages.
You have to really, really snag her in the synopsis and then those first 3 chapters. I mean, they have to really be dynamite in order for her to even bother. So then after she read the synopsis and in the first 3 chapters, then what happened?
Well, the first thing was she wasn't too thrilled with my dialogue. She wanted me to go over all of my dialogue again, which I did, and she said it was too stilted. So I went over it again and used contractions. That's all I had to do, you know, and it worked that way, you know. So that's all I did, and she took me on as a client. No written contract, just word of mouth, which some agents want a written contract, and I've known authors who have signed their life away for 3 to 5 years and been very unhappy, you know. And but a lot of them, it's just, you know, handshake kind of thing.
And is this the common way of going about publishing a romance novel?
Okay, if you're writing category romance, you don't need an agent, and I wouldn't even recommend you getting one, because their contracts are sort of written in stone. There isn't much you can do, because Harlequin and Silhouette have just about sewed up the contemporary romance market, and they know it. So you just can't get away with, maybe you can get a little bit more money if you have an agent, but then that little more money that you get probably is going to pay your agents 15%. So you're really not getting much out of that.
Category romance is the Harlequin and the Silhouette.
Contemporaries.
Contemporaries, yeah. And they're shorter. They tend to be shorter, don't they, than this sort of thing that you write?
That.
Yeah. So, but if you're going to write an historical romance novel like you have, it's best to have an agent.
Yes, because it's, okay, especially nowadays, and I'll tell you why. Right now, we're going through what's called a mid-list crisis, and that is everyone's downsizing. Every industry in America seems to be downsizing, and so is the publishing industry. And right now, places where you used to be able to buy a romance, like in your local drugstore or grocery store, now all they have are the top 10. You know, the bestsellers, and all of their backlist, every book they ever wrote. And so that's not, there's no room left for the romance or any other genre, you know, novels. And so it's more important than ever to have an agent to help you get your foot in the door, because the length of time also that it's taking for them to read your proposal, oh my goodness. It can be up to a year for, like, Tor Forge, who does science fiction.
These are publishers.
Yeah. Yeah.
How long did it take for them to go through your first and for you to get, once you signed on with this agent and you shook her hand and said, okay, yes, let's go with this, then how long did it take for her to find somebody who was interested in?
Okay, it took a whole year. And the reason was my first book was a time travel. And it was at a time when time travels were not very popular. They were just coming into their own, and the editors were tired of reading really badly written ones. And so they thought that only an established writer could write one. So I got turned down by 5 publishers. And the 5th one actually wanted it, but her boss turned it down. So then, meanwhile, while my agent is sending that proposal around to the 5 different publishers, which took a whole year just to go to 5 publishers, okay, I was writing my second book. And I finished it in that time. So this editor who finally really loved that first time travel, wanted to buy it. She was just madly in love with it, but her boss said no. So her boss went on maternity leave. Oh. And that's when she, you know, jumped right in there and bought it. And she bought my second book too, which came out first.
Great. Well, there's a twist. Seize the opportunity. So that's when you signed on. Now, did you sign on with them and they say, we'll give you a deal to write 5 books, or did you just submit it 1 book at a time?
Well, with my first book, we just did a 1-book contract. With they always have the option on your next book. This is how they get you, because you have to show it to them first. And the only way you can get out of not selling it to them is if you're not happy with the money. And then you're free to go to another publisher as long as they offer you more than your original publisher. But I have signed a 3-book contract, which was the last contract I was in, was a 3-book contract. And I never want to do that again, because first of all, you're locked into a certain amount of money that you're getting for each book. And by that time, I was disillusioned kind of with my publisher and wanted to look for another, but I had these 3 books I had to write, you know.
Right, so you're sort of tied down to that, yeah. And meantime, you become wildly popular, and everybody and their mother wants to buy the book, and you sold it for a less than desirable amount. Can we talk just a minute about you know, what kind of money we're talking about here? Do they give you an advance to write the book, an advance on the royalties?
Yeah, you get your advance usually in two. If you're in a one-book contract, they divide the advance in twos. You get your first half when you sign your contract, and then you get your second half when they accept your finished product.
For a first-time writer, can you talk about numbers of figures?
4 figures.
4 figures?
Yeah.
For your first book. And then if that's successful, does it go up?
They go up in like $500 or $1,000 increments.
Oh, I see.
Unless you've got a really, you know, good agent who can get more.
And this is an advance on the royalties, and then beyond the first print or whatever, do you get a percentage of what's sold after that?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, and it's very, with my first book, and my publisher's notorious for lower percentages of the retail price,
right?
I guess. And that was only 4%.
4%.
And 6 to 8% is the norm.
So you're going to have to write a lot of books to end up being filthy rich.
The first month that my first book came out, I sold 34,000 books in 1 month, and I was really shocked, you know.
Really?
Yeah.
And when they gave you the royalties, the advance on the royalties, did they give that on a certain number of books? Did they say, we'll pay you for the first
That's
print?
tricky, too, because they hold back in reserve because the publishing industry works in this way. The booksellers will order a certain amount of books, but they have rights of being able to return them without any penalty, and they don't have to just buy them up front, you know?
Sure.
So you have to wait till all the returns are in.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, so if a store doesn't sell all the books, then what the heck. All right, let's move on a little bit to talk a bit about how you come up with the ideas for your stories. You say you see a scene. Is that where you, I mean, is that really where the story comes from, is a scene, or do you know, where does that come from?
It comes from just about anywhere. My very first book, it was really strange, and I only thought I had one book in me because of this strange experience I had. This is going to make me sound really crazy, but I was in a graveyard, and I've always loved old things, you know, although I used to be afraid to go in a graveyard. But I like to go in them when I became an adult to do gravestone rubbings. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, where you take a piece of
oil
paper?
paint,
yes,
and you put, you know, and then you get the image of the tombstone. And so we were wandering around in this really ancient graveyard looking for a really good stone to do, and I saw this tombstone, and the name hit me immediately. Elizabeth Hawks was the name of the woman. And then I read her epitaph, which actually scared me. I had never heard it before, even though it was a common one for its time. And let's see if I can remember it. Pray, kind reader, lend an ear. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be. Prepare for death and follow me.
Whoa.
It scared the heck out of me. And I took it very personally.
Well, yeah, I guess. That's sort of what they wanted you to do, right?
And what happened was, immediately, I felt some kind of psychic connection to Elizabeth Hawks. I really and truly did. And after that, I really felt like she was haunting me. And I came up with this idea for this story. And she's not my main character, but she's a very strong character in my book.
Did you research her to
Yes,
find
I
out who
did.
she
She's
was?
real, and her husband was a hero. Now, here's where we talk about that taboo part, where for romance writing, you're not supposed to have any adultery. Your heroine should be monogamous. And here I had my heroine, who was a modern-day woman who gets thrown back in time to be with John Hawks because she's in love with him, and she touches his sword, and it's in the touching of the sword that she goes back in time. And he's married. He's married to Elizabeth. So I had to work that out. So here's where motivation comes in. It was a marriage in name only. And there was good reason why he married her. And that, of course, all comes out in the book. And so I think my readers forgave me for that because I had good motivation for it, you know.
All of this
and everyone ends up happily ever after, you know, even Elizabeth.
And all of this comes from reading the tombstone on that.
The whole story came from that.
And do all your other books have such odd sort of motivations for the topics?
In the beginning they did, but now I can sort of, whenever I need a plot, and my friends are very envious of me for this. They get really mad at me how easily I can come up with a plot. And now I just say, well, I need to do a story. What time period do I want to write in? Well, since I lived in St. Augustine, about a half a mile from Moultrie Creek, where Osceola was captured and betrayed by the Army, I said, why not write one about him, you know? And that's when, so I can start and just come up with it like that. You know?
Very quickly, can we talk just briefly about how you organize your book? Are you like some writers who just sort of start and then write wherever it goes, or do you lay out sort of skeleton of your plot and already know kind of what's going to happen at the end and then sort of flesh it out?
Well, I think every writer needs to know their main characters, what the main conflict is in that book, and how that conflict is going to be resolved. And that's all I need to know. But I will not start writing. I won't write one word until I know that this is a publishable book. I'm not going to waste my time writing down, you know, the story, not knowing what's going to happen, and then it turns out not to be interesting.
Well, but how do you make that determination before you've even written anything?
Because if it really intrigues me, if it excites me, if it makes me want to write it, then I know that I must have a pretty good story going there. You know?
Do you have categories that you know, it has to have a little of this and it has to have a little of that that you...
I don't pay any attention to anything except what's in my heart to write, which I think is the way everyone should approach their writing, really.
So you don't do any formula work at all, then?
No, no. I just write whatever I want to write, but I know that I have this passion to write that story, and that's what keeps you going. And you better have that passion, especially with your first book. You have to become obsessive, really obsessive, in order to get it done, you know? Because when I was writing that first book, I'm sitting at my typewriter, and I'm thinking, why am I doing this? Here I am at least 8 hours a day, day after day. I don't know if this is going to sell. I don't know if I'm wasting my time here, you know? And in a way, you feel almost like a fool to be, you know why? Because I had written 5 short stories, 5 of them, tried to get them published. Nobody wanted them. So I said to myself, why do I think I can write a novel if I can't even get a short story published, you know? So.
Let's take a few moments as we wind down our time here to offer up some basic tips to other people who might be out there saying, I'd like to do that. What kind of things would you suggest that they do to help them get their first novel published?
Okay, the first thing they need to do is to write what's in their heart, and not because it's a trend, not because time travels are hot, or angel stories, which the market is full of angels. I had an angel story, but I decided not to write it because there was too many of them out there. You know? So write what you want to write, and don't pay any attention to the trends. Then read the new authors that are getting published. Don't read your established ones because they get away with bad writing, because they've been around and everyone loves them so much, and maybe their editors are afraid to touch their work, you know. Read the new ones, because those are the authors that are compelling enough to get published nowadays in this tough, tight market. So I think you have to read the genre that you're writing in, but you also read other genres too. Read mystery, read, you know, horror, read everything to get a nice rounded education there, you know.
Would you recommend that they take a course of some sort or hook up with some sort of
Romance Writers of America. If you're writing romance, you better join that, because first of all, most of the published authors, the romance writers, belong to it. I belong to it. I belong to 3 or 4 different chapters of it, you know. And that's where you're going to get your latest information. That's where they're going to help you to know if your manuscript is on target or whether you've got problem areas.
Kind of a network where you can bounce ideas off.
The network is very important, it really. And then there's the annual national conference, which is wonderful to go to. And you meet all the stars there, and there's all kinds of workshops on how to write. So I would definitely suggest, if you're going to write romance, then join the RWA.
Okay. Are you writing anything now? Or, okay.
Oh, yeah.
And you have two more books to publish with this?
No, I've already done that 3-book contract.
Oh, there you go.
But I'm still with the same publisher. Okay. Because I wrote, in this very conservative time, I decided to write a story with my heroine who is half human, half fairy. And it's and my fairies are very sexy.
Uh-huh.
It's easy to let your imagination go when you're writing about other creatures, I think. And everyone, all the publishers that, my agent was so thrilled with this book. She hand-delivered it to 5 different publishers, and they all loved it. They said it was the most original thing they ever read, very creative, but this is a very conservative time. They thought it was too risky, so my publisher will take anything of mine, so it's... So it's coming out next year. It's called The Enchanting.
The Enchanting. Okay, we'll have to watch for it. Thank you very much, Sandra. Really an interesting conversation about writing for romance novels, and it's nice to meet you.
It was nice to meet you,
Thanks
too.
Thanks for joining us. And thank you for joining us on Writer to Writer, program about writing for writers, and it's sponsored by the Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm Marcia Ladendorff.